Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensies. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today I have another special guest with me, Steven Nemes, and we're going to be talking about divine simplicity. And so before we jump in, Steven, thanks for coming on the podcast, man.
Thank you for having me.
So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, your area of academic interest?
Sure. I am a doctoral candidate at Fuller Theological Seminary studying under Dr. Oliver Crisp. My dissertation is titled A Constructive Theological Phenomenology of Scripture. So I would say that my principal research interest is philosophical theology. On the philosophical side, I try to be phenomenological. On the theological side, I tried to be broadly ecumenical and orthodox without being strictly confessional in any particular sense, although I'm sort of hard to pin. My theological inclinations and sympathies lie in Reformed theology, Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, I'm sort of all over the place. So I try to be, like I said, ecumenical and orthodox without being strictly confessional.
Yeah.
Like I said, philosophically, my influences are principally in phenomenology, and my dissertation is a phenomenological work, but I also am influenced by Thomism, and my background is in analytic philosophy. So even though I study phenomenology and I do phenomenology, I have a background in analytic philosophy, and that certainly influences the way that I write.
Yeah.
And I've interacted a lot with, the so-called Fuller School of Analytic Theology, people like, Dr. Arkady, Dr. Turner, Dr. Wessling, Dr. Crisp, Dr. Woznicki. So I interact with those guys, all of whom have some connection with analytic philosophy and write in a sort of an analytic philosophical way. So I'm a blend of a lot of different influences. That's really what I am.
Well, that's so cool too. There's like this movement. Maybe it's been longer than it's been going on longer than I know, but of analytic Christian philosophers, at least, going back to phenomenology and bringing it up to date, using it in constructive theology and philosophy. I just had Brandon Rickaba on, and his project is the unity of consciousness, and he's using Husserl, and it's this deep, really, really analytic. I was super lost until he was explaining it to me, but he's using Husserl, and it was so cool to see that this analytic kind of continental divide that you guys you're bridging it. It's sweet.
Yeah. So Brandon Rickaba, talks about Husserl probably because he's influenced by like J.P. Moreland and Dallas Willard, and these guys, dealt with Husserl through Willard. Dallas Willard, had studied Husserl and had written a lot about him. I wish that more analytic, philosophers and analytic theologians would interact with phenomenology, because I always, what's interesting is, as you go on throughout your life and you think about things, you have different impulses or tendencies of thinking, habits of thought within you. And depending on what you're reading or what you're working on at some point in time, certain tendencies and habits of thought are amplified and cultivated, and others are left to the side. I always had this phenomenological bent. I always had this sort of preoccupation with conscious experience, but it was only until later on in my life that I found phenomenological literature, which gave me a vocabulary and a way of expressing that impulse, that tendency of thought, which previously had been dormant. Yeah. So I've always had this kind of phenomenological bent, but actually reading phenomenology later in my life helped me to recognize it for what it was and to put it into words and to, really strengthen it and fortify it and cultivate it, make it into something more than just this inchoate tendency of thought.
Yeah. What, who do you like? Who do you like phenomenology wise?
I think so. I wanted for a while to read phenomenology, but it was only until I read Introduction to Phenomenology by Robert Sokolowski that I really was able to understand what is being said. So I think that text by Robert Sokolowski is extremely important. Dan Zahavi also has a book called Phenomenology the Basics, which is excellent, a very accessible introduction. And in general, I think Dan Zahavi is one of the more accessible phenomenological writers. But I think my favorites are certainly Jean-Luc Marion and Michel Henry. They are less easy to read. I think I appreciate them more because I'm familiar with the phenomenological vocabulary and the way of thinking and
Yeah.
It's true that phenomenology, like somebody once said, to become a phenomenologist, the scales have to fall off your eyes. You have to learn how to think and to see things in a different way, from a different angle. But once you do, there's no turning back. Once you are able to finally see, take the phenomenologist point of view on something, it's like there's no way to return to another way of doing philosophy. You realize that all of philosophy has to be done from this point of view.
Yeah.
And it took a while, but once I was able to really, sort of adopt that attitude and to really learn how to think from that point of view, it just became natural for me. It's just the way that I do philosophy now.
Yeah.
But I would say that my favorite phenomenologist lately, at least, is Michel Henry.
Okay.
He has 2 books on Christianity, which offer he has more books on Christianity, but he has 2 books which offer a kind of a phenomenological interpretation of Christianity. One of them is called I Am the Truth, Toward a Philosophy of Christianity. And the other one is called Words of Christ. And Words of Christ was something that he finished writing, or that he wrote very shortly before his death. And it was published in French, I think, in 2002 or so. And it was published in English in translation in 2012. So Words of Christ, I've been reading that one lately. And I have to say that Michel Henry has really been influencing my own understanding of Christianity. This is what's interesting about him. We tend to think of Christianity as positing various realities, objective realities out there in the world. We think that Paul really did go from Jerusalem to Athens or whatever. He did all these missions. We tend to think of the truths of Christianity as being objective truths that are to be sought in the objectivity of the outside world, so to speak. What's interesting about Michel Henry is that he reinterprets Christianity to be fundamentally about subjectivity. He thinks that the real teaching of Christianity are truths about subjective life. They're not about the world. He doesn't mean to say, of course, that like Jesus never existed or that Paul didn't do those missions. He just means to say that the substance of Christian teaching is not about things that happen in the world. It's about these facts of subjectivity. And the most interesting one, I just recently submitted a paper for review on this topic. The most interesting one is he says that God, this is going to be exactly the opposite of what we're going to talk about today with divine simplicity. He says that God is not, being or something like that out there in the world in the realm of objectivity. He says God is life. And he doesn't mean by life a sort of a universal property that all living things have.
The force or something, right?
Yeah, no, he means like subsistent life, a subsistent living, absolute life, as he calls it. And all of us, insofar as we're living, insofar as we have life, not as this biological property of our bodies, but as a phenomenological, a sense of ourselves, as long as we are aware of ourselves as living.
We participate in him? Is that
right? Exactly.
Okay.
Right. And so he thinks that the fundamental teachings of Christ are about this relationship between the the particular living human being, vivant is what he calls it, and absolute life, which is God. Yeah. He says everything turns back to this, the relationship between the finite living being and God as absolute life, in which the living being participates. And what's interesting, I love this passage where he quotes from Meister Eckhart. He says that if we accept this definition of God as absolute life, then it follows that we know what God is. And this is going to be exactly the opposite of what I'm going to tell you later about divine simplicity. Yeah. If we accept this definition of God as absolute life, we know what God is. And he cites this passage from Meister Eckhart where he calls the human being ein Gottwissender Mensch, a human being who knows God. So he thinks that this is one of the biggest differences in locating God in the realm of subjectivity rather than in the realm of objective being, is that you actually know what God is and you are constantly with God all the time. As long as you're alive, God is continually giving you life, and you know what God is. So I have been thinking a lot about this. I just wrote a paper in which I compare Thomas Aquinas's argument for the existence of God in the De Ente et Essentia with this stuff from Michel Henry in Words of Christ, because I think that the two arguments are formally very similar, but they end up in very different places with respect to what it is that God is and how can we know him. So I just wrote a paper where I talk about that and I compare the two philosophies. This is a project that I want to pursue further. Two ways to God, depending on whether you start with objective being or subjective life, and what are the differences for our conception of God, depending on where you start philosophically. That's a project that I want to pursue further.
That's huge. Just real quick. So this isn't a podcast on phenomenology, but it's so interesting. Does Henri does he have a place for the creator-creature distinction in that model?
What's interesting? He because he is not a metaphysician, and because he, doesn't begin with objectivity. So for him, in his mind, there's a fundamental decision to make about how to pursue philosophy. You can begin with objectivity, or you can begin with life and subjectivity. And so because he begins with subjectivity, he doesn't talk about things in exactly the same terms. It's not as if he doesn't believe in a creation, but some people, for example, do criticize him on precisely this point. There's another phenomenologist. His name is Felix O'murcada. He teaches in Ireland, and he has a book called Phenomenology of Christian Life, and he critiques Henri on precisely this point. He says that Henri's conception of things, beginning with subjectivity and so on, kind of undermines the Christian preoccupation with creation. And he says that there's no real obvious place in Henri's interpretation of Christianity for Christ to save the created cosmos.
Okay.
Henri sort of really talks badly about creation and about objective being. That's because he thinks that, after the 20th century, after the phenomenology of the 20th century, really all you can say about objectivity is that it is this realm of like endless hermeneutics where you're constantly interpreting, and there's always a new angle to look at things, and you can't really come at a final answer.
Yeah.
And things are passing away. It's like this this like the flux of Heraclitus, where you just can't grab onto anything.
Yeah.
He says that the problem with situating Christian teaching and Christian truth in this realm is that really, strictly speaking, nothing is true here. You just have a bunch of opinions and a bunch of appearances, and you have this endless hermeneutics. He thinks
you look at Protestants and all the different denominations, and
right. He says you have to situate the truth of Christianity in subjectivity, because that's really where truth is. And he'll say at the end of the day, there is no such thing as an objectivity that doesn't presuppose a subjectivity, right? There are no objects; they're just objects for subjects. And if things didn't appear to us, then we wouldn't know what to say about them.
Yeah.
Right? So we can only talk about things as they appear to us, and so we are ourselves included in the definition of objectivity. So he would say something like, starting with objectivity is disastrous, because in the first place, you will never be able to find God in this objective world of fluctuating appearances. And in the second place, there is no such thing as an objectivity. The actual direction is objectivity is founded on subjectivity. Subjectivity is not something that arises within the subjective realm, in some emergent way. Rather, objectivity presupposes subjectivity. So that's probably what he would say in response to that critique.
I like that, studying like philosophy of mind stuff. I like that because there's like this modernist bent that you got to build up subjectivity from the objective, and if we can, we'll rid ourselves of the first person perspective anyways to get to the objective scientific third person.
Right.
But it does sound weird to say like, there's no objective truth. I don't know. I feel like we need to have that tension, right? Of like, there is the object. You can't get rid of the subject, obviously. I guess just for our listeners here who don't know about phenomenology, well, we've talked about it a lot, the phenomena and the noumena. Can you give us just a quick definition? How do you define phenomenology?
So if you go etymologically, phenomenology is reasoned discourse or logos about what appears, the phenomenon. But if you want a more colloquial definition, Robert Sokolowski, in that book that I referenced, Introduction to Phenomenology, he defines it as the study of human experience and of the ways in which things present themselves to us in and through such experience.
Yeah.
So the idea for phenomenology is that experience is where we find out about things. Experience is where we learn about being, right? So phenomenology is the study of things through the way that they're encountered in experience, right? We don't start with theories. We don't start with like assumptions about what things have to be. We go to experience and we'd say, okay, how does this thing show itself to me in experience? What am I actually, justified in saying about it, given the way that it discloses itself in experience?
Yeah. Okay. I like that. That sounds the more modern folks that you're just talking about, Henri, sounds like, so we've talked about Kant's divide between the phenomenal and the noumenal. It sounds like he's just kind of adopted the phenomenal and said, this is it. There is no noumena.
Right.
Everything is phenomena, and that's okay. And that's the way it is. Does that sound like what he's doing?
I think that that's fairly accurate. as a general statement of the phenomenological position. I mean, for example, you find arguments like this in Berkeley, and then you find Maurice Merleau-Ponty giving arguments like this later on, and even referencing Berkeley.
Yeah.
He'll say, "Why even talk about a noumenon, right? If I literally cannot experience it, if it does not show itself,
Yeah.
if all that I have access to are phenomena, why would I posit anything beyond that?" And you might give an argument like this. You might say that, I can only be justified in asserting something if it shows itself to me in some way, right? So the justification for my assertions are precisely acts of consciousness. But a noumenon, a genuine noumenon, could not show itself to me at all, because otherwise it would become phenomenal.
Right.
So therefore, there could be no reason for positing could be no justification for positing something beyond what appears. So of course we have to be clear, in phenomenology, appearance is not necessarily like sensual appearance, right? So there are other phenomenology is concerned with intuition. The word the word for like an experience where something is present to you is intuition in phenomenology. So for example, if I look over there, I can intuit my dog because it's laying over there. But there are other forms of intuition. It's not just like sensual objects that are intuited. Mathematical truths are intuited because you can gain a grasp of the concept, 2, for example, and addition and equality, and then you can form the notion of 2 + 2 = 4. Right. Yeah. So mathematical truths are something that are things that can be intuited.
Quarks and subatomic particles and stuff.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, if they are real, in principle, they can be intuited. Maybe if right now they're just hypothetically posited, and maybe but if they're real in some way, there should be some experience, some form of consciousness where their presence could be intuited. If we're going to posit them.
Okay.
So but that would be the idea, right? The idea is that like anything that can be intuited in some way can be asserted.
Yeah.
But the noumenon, by definition, cannot be intuited because it cannot become an object of consciousness, and so therefore it cannot be asserted.
That seems like what a lot of Christians have critiqued Kant over his transcendental idealism, saying, well, that doesn't actually get us to reality, so we're left in skepticism. And so it sounds like the phenomenologists go, well, no, it's just there's no escape from the phenomenal realm because it's the realm that we experience things in. So you're asking me to experience something I can't experience, and I'm not worried about that critique. Is that
right? Exactly. And Maurice Merleau-Ponty even says this. He says, what possible meaning could something have for me if it literally cannot be experienced? Like, why would it doesn't show itself. I could never feel it. I could never see it. I could never intuit it at the end of an argument, right? I could never form any. Why do I care about it? If it literally is nothing to me, why should I care about it? Why should I posit it?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, this is really interesting stuff. So for listeners who are not interested in phenomenology, sorry, but it was too good for me to pass up there.
Well, if you want to talk about this stuff again, I've completed my dissertation. It's a phenomenology of scripture, and it incidentally is the first phenomenology of scripture that's been written, as far as I know. Other people have written on the topic of phenomenology of scripture, but nobody's ever done a complete discussion of a phenomenology of scripture and everything that entails. So if you want, we could talk about all this stuff on another occasion.
We gotta do it.
I know we're supposed to talk about divine simplicity now, but we could talk about all this stuff.
That would be fantastic. Yeah. Just a really quick following up. So I gained a new appreciation for at least Husserl from like Roger Scruton, and he talks about like the Lebenswelt and the
life world.
life world, yeah. And that was so cool to me because I respect this dude as an analytic philosopher, and he's a popularizer too, or was, but he's doing this really good work of going back like to the split where phenomenology first started and analytic philosophy started, and they were friends and they liked each other before all the beef. And so I just appreciate what you're doing, and Aaron Preston and Brendan Rickabaugh, some of these guys who are saying, well, I don't care. I'm not buying into the modern debate. I'm going back, and if I can use it, I'll use it.
Yeah. I have a similar attitude. I don't particularly care to be doing anything, specific. I do phenomenology, but I don't have like qualms about departing from Husserl or departing from Merleau-Ponty or any of these guys. I don't have a concern with doing anything particularly. I just want to do philosophy and theology, right? And however it is that it turns out, wherever I just draw from whatever sources seem useful to me and seem right, and whatever I come up with, that's what I think is true.
Yeah.
I don't care to be doing anything in particular.
Yeah, Steven, this brings us to classical theism. So you're a classical theist, and it sounds pretty weird to be like, yeah, he's a classical theist and he's a phenomenologist, and
Yeah.
because in my mind, man, maybe this is a prejudice, but I think of classical theism. Usually, the dudes are super duper hardcore. Like, this is the way it is, and if you depart from this, you're departing from Christian history. You're departing from, so that's not you, which is really cool. Can you help us? Like, what is classical theism, and why are you a classical theist?
Yeah. Classical theism, you might sort of define it historically. Classical theism is that, conception of God which was dominant, let's say, for like the first 1500 years of church history or something.
Yeah.
And that has some overlap with the conception of God in other religions, like in medieval Judaism, in Maimonides, for example, or in Islam, even in theistic versions of Hinduism, and even like the non-dual versions of Vedanta, for example, describe Brahman in categories that are reminiscent of the more apophatic wings of classical Christian theism.
Interesting.
Basically, I think the idea in classical theism, I'm trying to remember, how did I define it for my students this year? I understand that for classical theism, God is first and foremost an absolute, right?
Okay.
The basis and the foundation of everything. That's the essential notion of God in absoluteness. Yeah, in classical theism.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Keep going, please. I'm just excited about absolutely.
Yeah, and so personally, I think that the most essential notion for classical theism is the doctrine of divine simplicity. Because divine simplicity is precisely a way of formulating God's absoluteness. So if everything else, right, if God is absolute and everything else is relative, well, one of the ways that things are relative is by being composite. And here we need to give a definition of the doctrine of divine simplicity. In my definition, which admittedly is idiosyncratic, I say that the doctrine of divine simplicity teaches that God is not an individual with qualities. So, for example, typically you'll hear people talk about God like divine simplicity like this. God is not composite. He's not a composite of matter and form. He's not a composite of essence and existence. Whatever properties he has, they're all really the same property, and he's identical to that. I think all those ways of talking about God are like they get at what classical theism is saying or what the doctrine of divine simplicity is saying, but I think that they're misleading. I think that the more straightforward way of formulating the doctrine of divine simplicity is just to say that God is not an individual with qualities. He is not an individual with properties.
Okay.
So in this way, we can distinguish between the individual with properties and God. God is not an individual with properties. He is not like, a being that exemplifies the nature of divinity, and, he's the only such being of, only being of such a kind, and that's why we have monotheism. Nothing like that. I prefer to just lean heavy into the apophatic interpretation of divine simplicity and say that God is not an individual with qualities. If you want to say something about him positively, you could say that he is just pure being or pure actuality, but he is not an individual with qualities. He is not something that is purely actual, because that would turn him into an individual with qualities. He is not something that possesses, the property of divinity or anything like that. He simply is not an individual with qualities at all.
Yeah. So you said this is idiosyncratic. So you said, I think you were addressing Aquinas there, like the actus purus, right? Like God is pure act. So you would say that God is not pure act?
No, it's not that I wouldn't say that he's pure act. It's that I would say that he's not an individual with qualities, so as to like make clear what is pure actuality.
Yeah.
Like, I don't mean, for example, that God has only actual properties and no potential properties. That's not what I mean.
Okay.
And that's not what Thomas meant either.
Okay.
By pure actuality, he means just pure isness, just pure actuality, right? And of course, that's another way of saying that God is not an individual with qualities. If he were, he would fit within some genus. And Aquinas everywhere denies that God, fits within a genus. He is not an individual of some kind.
Yeah, if there's some genus, then it can be instantiated again. There could be all other gods, or just even if it isn't, or it could like logically be such that there are other gods.
Right. I mean, there's nothing about the genus as such that prevents it from being multiply exemplified. Right? So even if there is actually only one cat in the entire world, there's nothing about felinity per se that excludes the possibility of other cats existing. But God is not like that. To say that God is in a genus is precisely to say that he is not within some category. He is not an instance of anything. And that's how, in order for me to communicate the same idea, I say that God is not an individual with qualities, because if he is not an individual with qualities, then he's not an instance of anything.
Yeah. So initially, that definition sounds like he's not an individual. It sounds like it's like countermanding his personality. He's not an individual. So, like,
Yeah.
can we say he about God?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nothing stops us.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want.
Well, it sounds like when you're saying he, you're like individuating him, right? Like there's this
Yeah.
being that's God, and he has, he loves us or something.
Yeah.
And it sounds like we're contradicting ourselves.
So
Yeah.
I will distinguish between classical theism and Christian classical theism.
Okay, cool.
For me, classical theism is a philosophical doctrine. Okay, it's a conception of God that begins on the basis of reflection about the principles of existence or the nature of the world, and it terminates in the the positing of this pure actuality, which is the basis of everything. Okay, so that's philosophical classical theism.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Here's another thing I'm going to say, and this will sound controversial, but I think actually that this is the truth, and it will save people a lot of headaches. There is nothing about the concept of God philosophically that demands that you adopt religious attitudes towards him. So I'm going to say that there's nothing about the philosophical classical theism that demands that you relate in a certain way to him. I think that religion as a mode of relating towards God is not something that flows out of the concept of God. It's something that flows out of life experiences. So there's nothing about pure actuality, that notion that demands that I worship it. But in my life, if I should have a moment where I'm just happy to be alive, and then I recognize that my life is itself because of God, then I can be thankful towards God. So the religious attitude begins in a life experience and not with the concept of God.
Yeah.
And Christianity is a religious tradition, right? It arose as a result of various religious experiences had by people. And within this tradition, you refer to God as he. That's just the traditional way of doing it. So I don't have any problem with that. It's not as if like of course, it can be misleading if I tend to think of God as just one more person like the rest of us.
Totally.
Right? Yeah. So it's a natural way of speaking because we are not born talking about God. We're born, and the first words that we learn are used to refer to created realities. So there's always going to be...
Mine was he with an uppercase H, though. Mine was
that was your first word. You're the chosen one, if that's true. So the language that we learn from our parents is used to refer to things.
Yeah.
So then when we start talking about God, we have in mind this metaphysical framework of referring to just one more thing. Of course, we don't have other language, so we have to use this language, but we just have to remember that when we talk about God, our language is partially inaccurate, right? Yeah. We talk about him as a he, but that doesn't mean that he is a male. Right. Or we talk about God as loving us, but that doesn't mean that he has emotions, or at least I'm going to say that doesn't mean that he has emotions. Like he looks at me in particular and he feels all giddy inside because he loves me. I don't think that's what it means.
Yeah.
So our language is inaccurate. It can be misleading if we lean too much into it. We have to proceed from the object and not from the mode of speaking. Right? Okay. We have to recognize that our mode of speaking is partly inaccurate, but it's just more convenient to talk in this way. So we just talk this way. And then, just remember to make the corrections when it's necessary.
Okay. Yeah. I'm looking forward to getting into more, philosophical, theological language. But real quick, I wanted to touch, I'm sure someone is thinking maybe the concept of God, if he's a necessary being, does entail that he's worthy of worship, being the highest, or being the creator himself. Like, have you considered, maybe someone's argued this already, but that like the actual concept of God would entail his worthiness, or his deserving of praise, philosophically?
I simply don't sympathize with that. I don't see anything about it, right, that demands that. I think part of what it is that people who are putting arguments like this are Christians. Oh, yeah. And so the word God has, worshipful connotations for them already. And so, when they start describing God, because they love God, they just can't help but to worship him. But they don't recognize that it's not the concept of God that is moving them to worship. It's some other thing that they associate with the concept. But
yeah, it's the Christian theology that's at play in your heart and your mind. Yeah,
exactly. I think it's like we have all these connotations with the word God in our mind. So anytime we talk about God, we're going to be inclined to worship him, or we're going to find something wonderful about him. But I don't think it's the concept of God that makes us want to worship him. It's some other thing. It's what he's done for us, for example, in Jesus Christ. That's what makes us want to worship him. And had he never done that, I mean, just think about it. There are people in the Old Testament, or there are people even now who like believe in God, but they don't see anything. They don't have a sort of an impulse to worship him.
Well, so
You know?
I have
So
in my head, I have a fundamentalist and a modernist, and they're always fighting with each other. And
yeah.
so I think of the fundamentalist saying, well, it's like Captain America, and it's like, well, there's one God, ma'am, and he doesn't dress like that or whatever.
Yeah.
So insofar as non-Christians are thinking of God and they're not drawn to worship, it's because they're suppressing the truth in their unrighteousness. It's not because there's a philosophical concept that they're actually they do have accurate knowledge of. If they did have accurate knowledge of him, then they would be led to worship. So I
So
think,
let me ask that
yeah,
question. Okay, let me ask this
please.
question. What is that accurate knowledge that moves to worship? Is it knowledge simply of God in himself, or is it a knowledge of God as he's related to you, or as you are related to him?
That's a good point. So different intuitions about God are going to lead us to different places. So some people would say, you might say that God can't be known in his essence, right? But only by his actions. And
Correct.
so if that's the case, then if they don't have, well, you could know God through his actions in creation, right? Creation testifies to the glory of God.
Yeah, and people do worship God, right?
Yeah.
So, like, you had pre-Christian worshipers of God. So I don't deny that. But what I'm saying is that it's not the concept of God that moves them to worship. It's
Okay.
the life experience. It's the recognition that this world comes from God and that is
Yes.
good. That's what
Okay.
makes them worship.
I think that's really helpful, and I think the fundamentalists in my head will shut up because of that. Because when you're looking at creation, that is the Lebenswelt. That's you looking around and seeing the trees and seeing the animals and going, "Oh, wow!" And that is different than just philosophical armchair reflection, saying, "Oh, there's this concept of this one being, and that's moving me to
Right.
worship." That's
Right,
good,
but
man. That's
I think
helpful.
you also have to be a certain sort of person,
Okay.
right? If you're like the Calliclean sophist, right, whose principal goal in life is simply to get whatever he wants, that person will never worship.
Hmm.
So you also have to be the right sort of person. Here again, this is where phenomenology is useful.
Yeah, you have to be a phenomenologist. You're saying,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There is no such thing as just a pure experience, right? Every experience is from a certain point of view.
Experience for me, right?
It's an experience for me,
Yeah.
and I also am. I experience myself.
Mhm.
Even though I experience the world, I'm also simultaneously experiencing myself. So, for
Yeah.
example, if I look over there, the door to my apartment looks blurry. That's not because it is blurry. That's because my eyesight is bad.
Mhm.
But I am also experiencing the door. So I am simultaneously experiencing the external object, the door, and also my body. So I'm experiencing myself and the world at the same time.
Yeah.
So that means that when somebody has an experience that moves them to worship God, they're not only experiencing God, they're also experiencing themselves. They find something worship worthy about God because of the way they are, right? They're,
Mhm.
let's say, a grateful person, or a person who is likely to give thanks for things. Okay. So if you are already that kind of person, then in the right conditions, you will worship God. If you are not that sort of person, you won't worship God, even in those conditions.
Yeah. Yeah,
You know,
there's like a reflexiveness to experience that Brandon Rickenbaugh talked about this, which is so crazy to hear in like deep, philosophy of mind. But you're experiencing, but then there's this other arrow that's directed back at you.
right?
And Kant talked about like the I think, but it's even deeper than just like the thought. It's the experience. You're
Mhm.
experiencing like your experiences.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
This is, Michel Henry calls this affectivity or self-affection, where you feel yourself,
Yeah.
right? So I'm like feeling myself as alive or as suffering or as joyful or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah. So just to emphasize the point, I mean, this Jesus says, for example, right? If whoever, what does he say in the Gospel according to John, where he says that whoever does the will of my Father will know that what I'm saying is true or whatever.
Mhm.
Uh, the sort of person that you are makes God worship worthy or not, makes God lovable or not, makes God um, uh, real or not to you, right? If you are the sort of person who is likely to be thankful for things, then when the right conditions arise and when you realize that all the good things that you have in your life are from God, then you'll be thankful to God.
Yeah.
But if you're not the sort of person to be thankful, then you will never give thanks to God. So it's the sort of person that you are also that makes God worship worthy. There's no thing as objective worship worthiness. It's just you either love God or you don't.
So I resonate with that, but I do want to affirm like some kind of objective worthiness. Like, one of my friends is here at TED's PhD student, super hardcore into Aquinas, and he was talking about his view on simplicity and stuff like that. And so God is like this fire, and your relation to the fire determines how you experience that. So if you're cold and you're standing at a safe distance, this fire is really nice. If you're drunk or whatever and you step into the fire, it's going to burn you.
Yeah,
Right? And
yeah,
so
yeah.
your relation, it's still a fire. It's always a fire. It's the same heat coming off,
Yeah.
but your relation to it determines how you're experiencing that fire.
Right.
What do you think? So then if that's the case, then God, it's your relation. If you're like super against authority, then you're going to not really like God. If you had a really terrible experience with your father, the concept of God as father is not going to be really great for you.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Well, just think about the fact there is no right way to relate to fire. It depends on what you want, right? If
Yeah.
you want to cook hot dogs or
Yeah.
or make s'mores, then fire's great. If you want to remain the owner of a house, then fire's bad.
Yeah.
If you want to get warm, fire's great. If you want to stay cool, fire's bad. So there is no right way to relate to fire. There's simply the right way to relate depending on your interests.
Well, how about like is there a telos in here, like the right way to relate to God because of our teleology, because we've been made in His image, He made us for the purpose of relation, and so there
So
would be a right.
this is, I think, the place to go. You would have to have some sort of like natural law, approach to religion, right? You would
Okay.
have to show that certain forms of relating to God conduce to human flourishing in ways that the failure to relate to God or other ways of relating to God do not.
Okay.
And that would, I think, just that you just have to. There's no way to do that sort of thing academically. You just live a life. You either
Yeah.
become a Christian or you don't, and then you see where it takes you. And there's no really like philosophical argument to give there. I think there's just simply the experiment of your whole life.
Okay.
I would also say this. I remember at 2000, in 2018 at the Los Angeles Theology Conference, Ian McFarland gave a lecture on theological anthropology, and he made this interesting point that the meaningfulness of a life with God is something added onto human nature. It's not intrinsic to human nature, right? So for McFarland, he was proposing what I've called a non-theological, anthropology,
Mhm.
where the human being is not by nature ordered to a relationship with God. The relationship to God is something that is given by grace. So it's the sort of super added gift. But it doesn't. It's human beings naturally can just live life without religion or whatever, and live an ordinary human life.
Mm.
A religious life in which you're related to God is something added by grace. So a life with God is a gift that God gives us, and He gives us simultaneously a capacity for this gift, but it doesn't belong to us by nature. It's simply a matter of grace.
Okay. I can hear all my reform friends going, no, but there's this covenant. Like you're in a covenantal relation, and you're covenant breakers, and yeah. So we got to talk about this in another one because this is so good. Let's jump into simplicity. Sorry for the abrupt transition here,
No,
but
that's okay.
what is the doctrine of simplicity? And just adding on that, is it merely an apophatic, a negative doctrine, or is it cataphatic? Is it a positive
Yeah.
doctrine?
Yeah, so as I said, in my interpretation, and this is going to be idiosyncratic, but I think that this is the best way of talking. In my interpretation, the doctrine of divine simplicity affirms that God is not an individual with qualities.
Mhm.
Okay, so that would be the negative statement. A positive statement would be God is pure actuality. Okay, so that's my preferred form of stating the idea.
Yeah.
But I think that these two ways of stating, maybe they have to go hand in hand, but I think that the negative formulation is more helpful.
Okay.
Because the proponent of divine simplicity is going to say that God exists. He's not nothing.
Yeah.
But he is going to say that he's not an individual with qualities. So it's a way of trying to isolate the notion of pure existence from an existing individual,
Mhm.
right? So you start with an existing individual, for example, my dog, and then I take away the dog and I leave the pure existence without limits, and then that is something like what God is, just pure being without limits, and the basis for the being of everything contingent.
Okay, and is that pure being? does that exist on a different level, or is God's being the same qualitative being that your dog has?
That's a good question. There's, that's the question of the doctrine of analogy, and I am not
Right.
at all an expert on this.
Okay.
So I can note various differences between my dog and God. For example, my dog exists as an individual thing, and God does not. The existence of my dog is diverse, right? He has various properties. He's a mammal. He has 2 eyes. He has 4 legs. He has black fur or hair, rather, and so on. He's young, right?
Yeah.
He's a meat eater. He has all these properties. God does not have distinct properties, right? He's not an individual with qualities. We can say that I was just reading this book by John Canassis called Thomistic Existentialism and Cosmological Reasoning, which is an excellent book on the doctrine of esse, or being, in Aquinas. We can say that my dog's existence is prior to it ontologically. So Thomas would say that, in Canassis' reading anyway, Thomas would say that the existence of my dog is an accident, but it's not like the accident of the blackness of its fur. The blackness of its fur is posterior to the substance, right? There has to be something there in order to be black. But the existence of the dog is not posterior, it's prior, because without existence, there is nothing there.
Okay.
So the existence of the dog is a kind of an accident that precedes the substance and produces the substance.
This is like existentialism sounding here.
Yeah. Only this all takes place at one point in time. It's not.
Okay.
It's not. Like you're born into the world and you have to figure out your essence. This takes place, in one metaphysical moment, so to speak.
Okay.
The existence is prior to the substance, and it produces the substance. And you might think that it has to somehow be directed at this substance in particular. So then you can clearly see how we get a doctrine of creation from here, right? If the existence of the particular substance is prior to it and produces it, then you see that the existence is sort of directed at this subject in a way, and then you get the notion of God as pure existence. So God is pure existence. He does not have the property of existing. For him, existence is not an accident, like in the case of my dog. He just is pure being.
If he did exist in that way, or was an instantiation of existence, then there'd be like this higher category of existence, which is instantiated in God and instantiated in the dog and instantiated in us. Yeah.
Right.
So we don't want to say that. Yeah.
And if he had a property of existence, well, Thomas Aquinas is going to say that means that his accident of existence would be prior to him, and then he would have to get it from somewhere. So God cannot be one more existing thing, because then he'd need a cause.
Yeah.
Every existing thing has to be caused by something which just is pure existence.
Yeah. Okay.
So these are ways in which the existence of God is distinct from the existence of the dog. God is purely actual. The dog is at least partly potential. It can get larger than it is now. It can. Right now, it's sleeping. It could be awake, etc.
Yeah. So initially, it freaks me out a little bit, because I'm thinking, I have, Van Talen lives in here too, and he always wants to talk about analogy. So it seems like, since God's not an individual, but he is like being itself, then I have this being, but I am an individual and I'm participating. If we're on the same level of being, then it seems like God is everything. Like, he's not an individual, but he's everywhere, and everything that exists is his being. Like it is him, and it seems like pantheism or like panpsychism or something.
So I would say that, so Thomas says that God is not the formal being of everything. So God is not the property of existence that everything has. God is subsistent existence, and everything else has the property of existence because of a relation to God.
Okay.
So God is like subsistent being, and then you have the substance with its own accident of existence, which is distinct from it and from God.
Okay.
So the existence that makes my dog exist is not God.
Yeah.
It's its own property of existence, but it comes from God.
Yeah.
So God is a subsistent existent, just subsistent being. And then this dog has its own act of being, which is particular to it, and by which it's distinct from God. So God is not just, everything, and neither is God just the existence that everything has. He is subsistent existence, and everything else has its own act of existence because of God.
Yeah. And I think that important point kind of gets to the qualitative difference. Even if you want to say being is one level and we all exist in the same level, one God's being is archetypal, it's original, everything else is derivative, yeah, synthetic, or whatever, however you want to say it. But I think that that's important. That gives us that qualitative difference in being, even if you want to say there's one level of existence like that.
Yeah, my own inclination is to say that from certain points of view, we're the same, and from certain points of view, we're not. So
Yeah.
here's one way in which we're not. God is pure actuality, whereas my dog, considered in itself, is a possible being, I would say. Considered in itself, my dog is a possible being, which becomes actual once God grants its own act of being, or its own, actuality. But the dog by itself is not an actual thing. It's just a possible thing. It's a possible participant in actuality, whereas God is purely actual with no possibility whatsoever, with no potentiality. So I would say that, depending on the angle that you take, here again, the phenomenology, depending on the angle that you take, God can be the same as us, or God could be different from us, radically different even, or analogous to us. So I'm not committed to one particular position. I think that just depending on where you start, or what angle you're looking at it from, you'll come up with a different way of describing the relation between God and beings.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. It's like the use of like perspectives is really important. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So why is this an important doctrine to hang on to? Why is simplicity so important? I mean, you put it like in theological triage earlier. You talked about how it's like foundational,
right,
to classical theism. Why not just, all these philosophers telling me, just drop it, man, let it go, it's okay. Why should I not let go of simplicity?
Well, the best reason not to let go of anything is because it's true. So I think that one reason why you shouldn't let go of divine simplicity is because it's true. I would say that simplicity, I mean, every other value that simplicity has, like it prevents us from, creating idols, or, idolatrous images of God, or taking knowledge of God for granted, or it allows us to synthesize various statements in the Bible about God's absoluteness and his uniqueness and his fundamentality, or whatever. All these other values ultimately converge on this point because it's true. That's just what it is.
Yeah.
So to my mind, that's the one reason why you should accept the doctrine of divine simplicity, because that's how God actually is.
Yeah. Okay. So what theological lifting does it do for us? How does it so it's true, and if it's true, then we need to believe it. But maybe even like pragmatically speaking, like if it's true, it should be interacting with the rest of our theology in a beneficial way to make sense, rather than be this, thorn in our side. How does simplicity help with Christian theology?
Well, I will give two ways of helping. One of them is in the matter of theological epistemology. Well, actually, they both have to do with theological epistemology, and they both have to do with the incarnation.
Okay.
So here's what I would say. In the first place, divine simplicity is important because it makes it clear that philosophically we don't know what God is. Okay, and precisely because we don't know what God is, he has to reveal himself. So the absolute unknowability of God prior to special revelation is what makes special revelation so important. And Thomas Aquinas gives this argument in the very first question, in the first book, in the first article of the Summa Theologica. He says, is revelation necessary? Is sacred doctrine necessary beyond philosophy? And he says, yes, because philosophically we don't know what God is, but our life, is ordered towards God. We have to know God for a good life. And so therefore there are some things about God that has to reveal to us. Precisely because we simply do not know what God is philosophically, for that reason, special revelation, the incarnation, I'm talking about the incarnation here, the incarnation becomes all the more important. You have contemporary theologians like Torrance and Barth, who are some of my favorites, who emphasize the incarnation as the sort of the principal lens through which to think about God, and I'm entirely on board with that. For whatever reason, they are also critical of natural theology, but I think that natural theology, understood in my own, idiosyncratic way, helps their case. Precisely because apart from Christ, I simply don't know what God is, or what to say about him, or how to relate to him. That's why Christ is all the more useful. Christ actually gives me language to speak about God. He gives me ways of thinking and of relating to God, so that I can go beyond the apophatic darkness of the philosophical theology and actually relate to God in more concrete and intentional ways.
Yeah.
And here's a second point. Once more, continuing in the same line of thought as Torrance and Barth. Precisely because God is absolutely simple and he cannot be otherwise than he is, not even across possible worlds, in absolutely no way whatsoever. for that reason, the way Christ is, that's how God is.
Mhm.
Right? For Barth, there's this worry about the God behind God, right? If God's act is not his being, then perhaps he comes into the world as Christ and he puts on a show, but behind the scenes he's really something else.
Yeah.
Divine simplicity says no, that isn't literally impossible for God. He cannot be otherwise than he is. And so when he incarnates, the way he is in Christ is the way he is.
Yeah.
And it's the way he has always been, and it's the way he is necessarily. So if Christ comes into the world and he shows us that God loves us, then God hating us is not even a logical possibility. He cannot be otherwise than that. God loves us. This is the absolute truth about God. And the doctrine of divine simplicity, first of all, makes the incarnation important. And in the second place, really solidifies what we learn in the incarnation, so that there is no other way of talking about God except for this. So this is why I think the doctrine of divine simplicity is so important for Christian theology, because it makes the incarnation important and it makes the incarnation absolutely central.
Yeah. That's helpful. So yeah, I used to have this debate back and forth with a Bardian friend here at TEDS in Dr. Arkadi's Analytic Theology course. Now he's at the Logos Institute, but where's Chris at? It's Logos. Is it called Institute? I always forget. Over there in
I don't know what it's called, but it's at St. Andrews.
Okay, St. Andrews. Yeah, he's at St. Andrews with studying there. So he would talk about. I think you might be partial to this too, like incarnation. Anyways, that in every possible world, Christ is coming to incarnate because he incarnated in this one, and because God is simple, because God he's consistent. So like the Son would always come. It was always the second person of the Trinity. And in a different possible world where man didn't fall, he's still incarnating. Is that incarnation anyways? I didn't get to that point in Chris' book, but
as far as I understand, incarnation anyway is the idea that even if human beings had not sinned, Christ would still have come into the world.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's the view that necessarily Christ comes into the world, because then that means that creation is necessary.
Yeah, and that gets us right to modal collapse, right?
Yeah, I would not say that Christ comes into the world necessarily. I would simply say that I would take a sort of a soft, incarnation anyway view, and I would say that could Christ have come into the world even if human beings had not sinned? Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
But I don't think that Christ comes into the world necessarily, because I don't think that there is a world necessarily. God might not have created.
Like a contingent necessity, though? Once creation is created, he...
No, I wouldn't even say that. It's just that he could, I don't think that God has to incarnate, but he could incarnate even apart from sin, right? So it's just a contingency. I wouldn't say that if he does make a world, then he has to incarnate. I wouldn't say that.
Okay, yeah, I've heard some Bardians go that route, and they're pretty hardcore because they want to emphasize the incarnation in all of their theology, right? And I like, I mean, that's what God did. He revealed himself in Christ. That's huge. But yeah, in doing so, they've made it a necessity that he would incarnate in every possible world. And I think that brings us to like this modal collapse, and God's not free then to incarnate. He must incarnate. It's like an emanation that he sneezed, like he had to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I don't think that I'm open to being convinced otherwise, but I don't think that anything about the incarnation, as we know about it in Scripture, demands that God have incarnated always. I think that if human beings sin, he could incarnate or he might not. If human beings don't sin, he could incarnate or he might not. And he might not create human beings at all. He might not create any world at all. So, I'm open to a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, so getting on to modal collapse then, if God is simple, then it seems like his incarnation isn't in relation to our sin, because then he is he's
reacting to something.
Reacting, exactly. Yeah, I was trying to think of well, he has passions or something, right?
Yeah. He's affected by things.
Mm-hmm. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I would. Okay, so the doctrine of divine simplicity, as I understand it, says that God, or entails that God is not within time. He doesn't go back and forth in time like us. He doesn't have a past or a future or anything like that. Furthermore, it means that he doesn't change. He doesn't go from being one way to being another way, not even across possible worlds. He is always exactly the same in every single possible world. And it also means that he is not affected by anything. Nothing affects him. He doesn't respond to things. He is not on the receiving end of any kind of causal relation. He just is purely actual. Everything is from him, but nothing is, at him. He is not affected by anything.
Yeah.
And so some people think that this entails a modal collapse. For example, they'll think that, okay, well, God made this world. That's the first premise. Furthermore, he made this world in virtue of what he is like, because that's how all causation operates. You cause in virtue of the way that you are. And if God could not be otherwise than the way that he is in this world, then that means that he could not fail to make this world.
Right.
And so this world is just as necessary as him. That's a sort of a basic, formulation of the modal collapse argument.
Yeah, the necessity collapses down, and then everything in creation is necessary, including me picking up this mug right now.
Right, or Christ incarnating, or exactly.
Yeah.
That's one of the more popular arguments against divine simplicity. But I don't think that it's a good argument, and I think that there's a way out of it. And the way out of it is to deny what I have called the difference principle. So I think that this argument presupposes a certain principle of causality, which it is open to the classical theist to deny.
Yeah.
The difference principle is this principle of causality goes like this. It says that a possible difference in effect requires a possible difference in cause. And I gave the example of going and turning on my car. Every day when I go home, or every day when I go to work, I open my car, I put the key in, I turn the key, and then the engine turns on. Okay, and there's this causal mechanism that takes place that explains why it is that turning the key, will turn on the engine of the car. Well, suppose one day I turn the key and nothing happens. Okay, this is a difference in effect. The one and the same activity has led to a different effect this time than previously. And so we naturally think that something must be different in the cause to account for this difference in effect. There's got to be something different about that entire mechanism that goes from turning the key to igniting the engine. There's got to be something different there to account for the fact that the effect is different.
Yeah.
So this difference principle is very plausible, right? A possible difference in effect demands a possible difference in the cause. If the cause is always the same, then the effect is always going to be the same. But I think that the modal collapse argument presupposes this principle, right? The only way that you can go from saying that God causes the world in virtue of the way he is to, therefore the world could not be other than what it is by saying that if the world were to be different, that means that God would have to be different. Right? That's the only way you can get that inference. But if you deny that, then there's a problem. God causes the world in virtue of the way that he is, but a different world might have been caused, God remaining unchanged, or no world at all. Once more, God remaining unchanged. So if you deny that the cause has to be different for the effect to be different, then you can escape the modal collapse argument for against divine simplicity.
Yeah. So with the car analogy, you're turning the key, and the cause is still the same. You turning the key, right? But something's wrong in the engine, and so it's not starting.
Right. So when I talk about the cause, I would say that like the whole process, that's the cause, right? So
including the ignition and the...
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Everything that begins with turning the key and then ends with the engine turning on, right? Everything included in that, whatever physical, I don't know much about cars, but whatever physical processes take place, that's the cause, right?
Yeah.
So something has to be different there in order to account for the difference in effect, namely that the car doesn't turn on.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm suggesting. So that's the different principle.
Okay, and you deny that with God and creation, but so if the world were to be different, then what would make it different if it's not God's decision? Because then it seems like, well, yeah, this would be the only possible world. If God's not changing, then how could he ever create a world that's different if nothing inside of God changes?
Yeah, well, this is mysterious, but I would say that the relationship between God and the whole of created reality, let's just call that the world, is indeterministic. So I think that indeterministic causation is precisely causation that does not obey the difference principle. And you can look at examples of, for example, like in the debates about free will, libertarians will posit indeterminism as a condition of free will. Now, what is indeterminism except the view that, you pause the tape of the world at a certain point in time, and everything here can remain exactly the same, but what follows could be different, right? Something might follow, but something else might follow. So also, right, it's like, suppose you believe that God creates the world in virtue of some sort of intention that he has. He makes a choice to create this world rather than another one. Even there, you have to deny the difference principle. What has to be different about God before making a choice in order to account for the fact that he makes this choice in this world, but a different choice in a different world? Even there, you have something that remains unchanged about God, whatever his essence is, for example, that is the same in every possible world. And then in some possible world, he chooses to create this cosmos. In another possible world, he chooses to create another cosmos. But there you have a denial of the difference principle, because there is nothing prior to the choice that accounts for, it.
Well, but aren't we then we're sneaking like indeterminism into God, right? Is that
Right. What I'm saying is that either the indeterminism is in God or the indeterminism is outside of God, but there's still a denial of the difference principle.
well? So if God creates in a compatibilist way, if he acts on his desires to create and creates with the intention for this conversation to happen,
Yeah.
then wouldn't that entail? Well, maybe maybe we don't go with that compatibilist view that God. It just seems weird to me. Like why does God create if not for his desire to create?
That's a good question. So if God has a desire to create, is that desire essential to him or is it contingent to him?
Yeah, so that's a really hard problem. I have it later in our notes here, but so his desire to create.
If it's essential to him, does it necessarily translate into a choice to create, or does it not?
I don't know. I don't know. Again, this is I want to go with mystery, but let's stay here. I think it could be essential without him acting on it, right? He could have this
Okay.
essential desire without it emanating from him in like Plotinus is one kind of sense.
Yeah.
Um,
So God essentially desires to create, but he doesn't always create, not in every possible world, right? So he has an essential desire, but it doesn't always translate into action.
yes,
Okay. So that means that you have two possible worlds, one where he creates, one where he doesn't.
and then if
If,
he does create, there's modal collapse in that world.
well, if you say that this desire translates into an action, then there's a modal collapse because it's essential. He will always have that desire, and so therefore he will always create.
But the create so his desire is to create, but not necessarily to create this exact world,
Okay.
but a good world, not the best possible world, but a good world, and a good world would entail some form of incarnation.
Okay, so we can make the same argument. We're just
Okay.
pushing it out a
Okay.
level. Right? So
Okay.
he has the desire to create. That's essential.
Hmm.
Okay, and then he has the contingent decision to make this world.
Hmm.
Right. Let's say that he also could have had a contingent decision to make a different world. Right. So there's a contingent decision here, a contingent decision there, and the essential desire here. All right. The relation here has to be indeterministic. You have to deny the difference principle because this is not different. This is the same.
Hmm.
This is different. Right.
Yeah.
So in both possible worlds, this is the same. This is different. That means that this can be the same and this turned out differently. So that's a denial of the difference principle. So it doesn't matter. You always have to deny the difference principle to avoid modal collapse. Whether
Yeah.
you put all the fun stuff inside of God in his mind, or you just push it straight outside of the world.
That's not so bad, man. I'm glad we walked through that because that helps. That's good. I'm glad you showed me there with my. I like it. I still have to think through it, but I like that. I think that's helpful. I wonder if simplicity is a problem for God's thoughts and God's desires. So God is simple. He's not composite, and yet, would you say God has divine? There are divine thoughts.
um, my inclination is to say no. I
Okay.
think that talking about divine thoughts is misleading because it makes me think of God as like this big disembodied mind, right? Like a Cartesian res cogitans
Hmm.
that just happens to sit at the bottom of the ontological ladder and everything else is baseline. I don't think that's what God is. So I would not talk about God's thoughts. Theologically, we talk about God's thoughts all the time. I know the thoughts that I have for you, thoughts
Hmm.
of prosperity and not destruction or whatever. So theologically, we talk about God's thoughts all the time, but metaphysically, can we talk about God having thoughts? Not in any straightforward way, because that would introduce composition into God. I think that when we take language like this that seems to introduce composition into God, we either interpret it as a negation or else we interpret it as describing a way that created things relate to God.
Hmm.
For example, let's take this idea. Did God intend to incarnate? That sounds like it's a thought. It's a mental thing in God's mind.
Hmm.
Well, if we're talking literally about an intention in God's mind, no, divine simplicity says we cannot posit any such things, right?
Hmm.
Because then we would make a distinction between God, his thoughts, and then himself as the subject of his thoughts. But perhaps we can say that God intended always to incarnate, by somehow placing this property in the world, right? All the events of the world led up to the moment of Christ's incarnation, let's say, right? So we can then add, because people typically think about the world as like just cause and effect, right? Physical cause and effect, and then like the meaning of thing is on top of this, somehow. We don't have to say that. We can say that the meaning of the world not only is cause and effect, but also these other forms of meaning. And we can say that God intended to incarnate in the sense that all the events in the history of the world led to the, were leading to the incarnation of Christ.
Yeah. So, okay.
So basically, to summarize, I would not say that God has thoughts if we mean that as a sort of an intrinsic, predication of God.
Okay.
But I would say that we can interpret the language of God's thoughts as referring to the world and the way that the world is created by God, or the way that it relates to God.
But you're not an idealist, right? Or are you? Because then, like, then we're just existing in God's mind, or like not in His mind, because that would negate simplicity. But like the whole world.
So that's a good question, right? So can the classical theist say that the world just is the thoughts of God, right? All the history of the world is this process of thinking on God's part, like a thought that He thinks.
Yeah.
I think that's also a possibility. I don't think it's just that it would be
maybe like a material thought or something. Like it's a thought that is out, but that would be outside of God, unless we're panentheists, right?
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, I don't know that pantheism is off bounds for classical theism either.
Okay.
So again, here I think it's just like we use different words to describe this, but like the substance is the same. So I think it's open to the classical theist to talk about all of history as a thought of God's, right?
Okay.
So this entire possible world is God's thought.
I like saying like novel, like, because I think that works well. It's like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is all his thought. Like that is his, even though it is external to him, he's not alive anymore, but yet I have his thoughts still in this book.
I like what you say. The only problem that I have is that the thoughts were in his mind first and then in the world.
So if thoughts are, I asked James Anderson about this, and I think him and Welty say that thoughts are not like parts, but they're actions. And so God, a simple God, people who hold to simplicity believe that God can act, and it not mess with not add composition to his being. And so if thoughts are actions, then likewise, there's no problem for simplicity. What do you think about that?
I'm not inclined to say that God can act, because I think that when we talk about God acting, we really mean that something happens in the world because of him. But when we talk about acting, for example, if I play the piano, there are two steps involved. First, I move my body, and then I affect the piano. Right? So my action is first on me and then on the world. I act on myself in order to affect the world. But that can't be how God acts. God must simply affect the world directly. So when we talk about God's actions, we really mean that things are happening in the world because of God. We're not describing something that happens in him.
Well, I would agree. We don't want to say like univocally that God acts in the same manner that we do when we play the piano, but analogically, could we say that this category of action, God acts in a way that is not univocal but is literal. He literally acts just like we literally act, but not in the same manner.
Yeah. So once more, it depends on your predilections and your sympathies. I think it's easier to talk in terms of a univocal denial than to talk in terms of an analogical affirmation.
Okay.
Because the univocal denial is clearer. When you make an analogical affirmation, you say that God acts, but in a different sense than we do. That doesn't leave you with a lot of like meat to grasp. Like you're not sure like what exactly is being said. Whereas if I just say no, God does not act because he does not, first act upon himself and then affect an outside reality. That it's a lot clearer what I'm saying.
Yeah, but
I have a preference for the univocal denial, but I think that you can go both ways.
Okay. Well, in the univocal denial, it seems like we might be accidentally denying some biblical phenomena, like him writing on the wall, or like wouldn't the incarnation be an action of God, or is it not?
Well, it is an action of God in the sense that it's something that takes place in the world because of God. But it is not an action of God in the sense that he does not first affect himself in order to affect an outside reality.
Right. So I think that works with analogical predication because we're saying though man has to act on himself before he can act, God God's action is literal, but it's not univocal in that God doesn't act on himself before he acts.
Yeah, he just directly produces an
Yeah.
external reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're saying the same thing.
Okay.
It's just
Okay.
that, some people I think have a preference for more positive and
Well,
affirmative language, and some people
yeah.
prefer to dwell on the negative, so to
Yeah,
speak.
I got Van Til and Frame and that whole school just living in just analogy, dude. Go with analogy. It's just living deep in there. Um, so do you have a couple more minutes to keep
Yeah,
going here?
go
Okay,
ahead.
cool. Have we sufficiently talked about modal collapse? Is there anything more? I mean, I get so excited about the other stuff, but is there anything else you want to add and kind of trying to refute this, um, problem?
Yeah, so I think that we touched on the essence of
Okay.
things. Basically, the fundamental premise and the assumed premise of the modal collapse argument is the difference principle.
Mhm.
Um, it's open to the classical theist to deny the difference principle. Furthermore, anybody who wants to avoid modal collapse has to deny the difference principle, because even if you're not a classical theist, even if you think that God has these like contingent desires and intentions to create and so on, you still have to deny the difference principle when it comes to the relation between whatever is necessary and whatever is contingent.
Yeah.
Right? The denial of the difference principle is fundamentally a way of understanding the relationship between necessity and contingency, and it's not something particular or peculiar to classical theists.
Yeah.
So that would be the third thing. And the fourth thing that I would say, this is something that I bring up also in my paper that you read.
Mhm.
When God creates, he does not first and foremost create an individual object. He creates the whole possible world.
Yeah.
So I consider that God's creative action is aimed at it produces an entire possible world, first and foremost, and me only secondarily, right? So
Yeah.
you and I are having this conversation not because God is causing you and me to exist directly right now, but because he actualized this world in which we do this. So that would be the final thing that I say. When God creates, he does not create first and foremost an object, a thing. He creates an entire possible world
Yeah.
at all times.
So this is infralapsarianism. Is that your position, or I mean, it doesn't really have to do with sin, I guess, but it would be that kind of that God creates the world first in the logical order rather than individuals and then creates a world to populate or to be the playground for these persons.
So I don't really have a committed position on that whole infra supra debate, but
Okay.
if what I'm saying now coheres better with the infralapsarian position, then perhaps that's what I hold. I don't know.
Okay. Um, yeah, that's interesting. I like that. So it's like this singular act. God didn't. Does this make us? Does this commit us to like a allegorical or like a non-literal interpretation of the 7 days of creation in Genesis? Because
No,
it
it doesn't. Maybe those are true. Maybe that's the way it actually happened. But my
well,
point
so
is God
yeah.
did not. So I
Do
think
you
I
see why I would think
Yeah,
that?
yeah. So you're saying, okay, well, Genesis says, okay, let's create light and dark, then let's create the sun, then let's
Yeah,
create the earth, then let's create all. So Genesis presents him sort of creating
yeah.
individual things. I
Even
admit,
even if it wasn't literal, even if it wasn't literal 7 days, if you're old Earth, then you're still. It would seem. I think old Earth folks would still want to say that even more so, right? There's this long periods where he's.
right.
Yeah. Okay.
So Genesis presents him as going from object to object, right? First, let's
Right.
do this. Then
That's
let's do
good.
this. Whereas I'm suggesting no, he just creates everything, all time, all history at once.
Mhm.
So now I understand what you mean. Yes, my position would entail a sort of an allegorical interpretation of Genesis from this point of view of God's creating an entire world rather than object and then proceeding to another object and then proceeding to another object.
Okay.
That's true.
Okay. So another objection from the fundamentalist who lives in my head would be this sounds a little bit like deism. Maybe he started the process, but he's not he's not actively working in the world to bring about his desired ends.
I think here it depends on your philosophy of time.
Okay.
So my inclination is to say that when God creates the whole possible world, he creates all times.
Ooh, this is
So
good. Yeah.
yeah, so my inclination is to say that all time exists
Yeah.
because God is causing it timelessly.
Yeah.
So that would be my way. So I'm not saying that like God creates the world and then it just sort of runs on its own, right?
Yeah.
God creates all time,
The whole thing. The
right?
whole
The whole
yeah.
talk. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. So that definitely gets you out of deism. Um, That's good. I didn't think about that. Yeah, that's really helpful. So the whole thing exists right now. Um, so Jesus is like still on the cross, though, right?
Well, he's at the cross then. He's not on the cross now.
Yeah. Because if I said now, I'm imposing I'm imposing like God's time or whatever. But in God's moment, I guess. But if it's like a novel, that's not that big a deal. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
This
I
is
mean,
good,
but
man.
from God's point of view, for example, Christ is crucified, 19, 1,970 years ago or something, or whatever it might be. But also from his point of view, he is also on the throne of the entire world in the kingdom, right? So every moment in time is equally present to God. So
And
Christ is
and
still
this
crucified then, but he's not crucified now.
and this includes like I never hear this talked about. I don't talk about it either. But this would include like the eschaton as well, right?
Yeah. The eschaton would be equally real to God.
Everything eternal into the future, or
Correct.
not eternal, but everlastingly, all of it into the future
Correct.
exists. Okay, that's interesting. So, how about the doctrine of the Trinity? So I came into this discussion, and I thought, simplicity is this kind of old doctrine because I grew up evangelifish and didn't know about it and stuff. And then I would listen to like Swinburne, or I'd read their books and stuff. The non-classical theists, and they're saying, simplicity is a problem for the Trinity. And then I get to Dr. Tom McCall's class on the Trinity, and he's showing how church throughout church history, they've used simplicity in order to bolster the Trinity,
Right.
and they did not find it as a problem. Can you explain, like, why would someone think that simplicity and the Trinity doctrine are at odds, and then help us think why they're not?
Well, you might think that they're at odds because the doctrine of the Trinity talks about a difference between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
And the doctrine of divine simplicity seems to talk about God such that there can be no internal differences to him.
Mhm.
So you might think like, okay, the divine simplicity and the doctrine of the Trinity, these are problems.
Mhm.
And it's not, it's not without reason that, for example, Arius and these guys thought that the doctrine, Christ could not be consubstantial with the Father because obviously the Father is simple and there's no such thing as consubstantiality among a simple principle. Whoever heard of such a thing?
Mhm.
But at the same time, you had, the Nicenes who were positing the consubstantiality of Father and Son while not giving up the doctrine of divine simplicity. This is the essential point. So everybody took it for granted. Obviously, God is simple.
Yeah.
Lord, bring the days where people can think like this again. Obviously, God is simple. I pray that we return to such times as those.
Yeah.
But they said, listen, although obviously God is simple, nevertheless, this is the way Christ's revelation demands that we talk.
Mhm.
Right? Christ demands that we talk about God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right.
So he said, we can't simply give up on what Christ teaches us just because it leads us into these philosophical problems. And so they basically, in my interpretation, and I think if you read like Louis Ayers or Khaled Anatolios on these topics, they'll say, like, obviously all these guys accepted the doctrine of divine simplicity. They thought that the divine simplicity was essential to preventing tritheism.
The Greeks, yeah.
Right, because if God was not absolutely simple, then you would have three gods. You would have three, just like in Swinburne, just like in, like some of these other social Trinitarians, you have three individuals that equally exemplify the divine nature. That's tritheism.
Right.
And they did not want to do that. So, they will say God is absolutely simple, and yet somehow there is within God this distinction between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and this is something that we could only know because of Christ. And incidentally, I actually write about this in my response to Crisp's book, Analyzing Doctrine, that we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast.
Yeah.
Crisp, the way that I talk about it, it's like this. I say, from the point of view of the contingent reality, God is absolutely simple.
Mhm.
Okay? So I'm sort of imposing a perspective, a sort of a phenomenological perspectivalism here.
Sure.
From the point of view of the created reality, God is absolutely simple.
Mhm.
But from the point of view of Christ, he is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So Christ offers a window into God that the created reality as such does not. Starting from the created reality, I reach the conclusion of an absolutely simple first principle.
Yeah.
If I start with Christ and the way that he talks, then I reach the conclusion that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, how these work together, I don't exactly know, but they're both visions of God, right? For example, I can see out my window and I can see the building as it's visible from here. and then I can go down, because I live on the third floor of this apartment building, I can go down to the bottom, and then I can see the building from a different angle.
Mhm.
I'm seeing the same building. It's just from different angles, it looks different.
Yeah.
So likewise, from the point of view of created reality, God looks like an absolutely simple first principle. And then from the point of view of Christ, God looks like Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
I am seeing the same thing in both cases. I'm seeing God, but it's just that Christ offers a unique perspective into the life of God that created reality does not.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. That's good. So, uh, does simplicity, does it make us affirm? Would we say God's simplicity is more fundamental than God's triunity or his threeness? The threeness oneness problem, right? Is oneness more foundational on a theology that holds to simplicity?
Well, I think it would be strictly speaking heretical to say that, because then you would have the persons above,
Right.
the nature. The
Yeah.
persons would be like this emergent thing out of the nature.
Right.
Whereas if you read, for example, Gregory or some of these other guys, they'll say, no, God subsists. The absolutely simple nature of God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
There is no God and then the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit on top of that. There is simply one level, God and Father, Son, Holy Spirit at the same level.
Yeah.
So I don't think that you should say that the nature is more fundamental than the persons. You should just say that this absolutely simple divine nature subsists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen, dude. So that's so helpful. And again, that's in my mind, that's Van Til, that's Bavinck talking about, absolute personality, that God is absolute personality, that's what's up. There's his oneness and his threeness are equal. They're equally ultimate. The threeness is not more foundational, and that's where I think you get into like tritheism or something like that, where you're overemphasizing the threeness to the detriment of his oneness, and then vice versa. You get modalism.
Right.
If you're going with oneness over his threeness, and then he's wearing different masks and stuff.
Right. Exactly. Orthodox Trinitarianism means the refusal to privilege the oneness or the threeness.
Yeah.
But then again, that exact thing is incomprehensible. Who can understand that?
Yeah.
Who can understand that the one is the three? So that's why I think at the end of the day, we have to say that the doctrine of the Trinity is a mystery. We are confronted in Christ with a mysterious God.
Yeah.
We don't know what he is, right? Once more, the doctrine we don't know what God is. We cannot simply take him, from his heights and force him into some created analogy or some created categories. We cannot do that. We will distort what he is.
Yeah.
We have to sit face to face with something that we cannot understand. That's what God is.
And that's another thing. So I learned this from James Anderson. I think it's so helpful. It's like and he's not original to him, but he made it. He put it in analytic form that because of who God is, it makes sense. So we're not punting into mystery and saying, I'm done thinking about it. But no, it actually conceptually makes sense that we wouldn't be able to understand him unless we were him. And so it makes sense that we can't fully comprehend him because he is creator. He exists in one being, three persons. Well, not one being, I guess, for you, right? Would you say he's one? How do you talk about his oneness?
Well, I would say he is one in substance and three in persons.
So one substance, three.
One in nature, three in person. Yeah.
And we are one in nature, one in person.
Correct.
And so for us, this unitary being trying to figure out the triune God, we're not going to fully comprehend, and that's okay. And that's actually a Christian doctrine. That's a good thing to affirm.
Yeah, I think it's good now and again to be confronted with the mysteriousness of things. I was just thinking about it because we went yesterday to buy the puppy, and the puppy didn't have a name before we bought it, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking how strange it felt, phenomenologically, how strange it felt to have something in front of you that doesn't have a name. Now we do this all the time. There are all kinds of every corner of my house. No corner of my house has a name. No particular piece of the carpet has a name. So I don't think about it. But it also doesn't mean anything to me. It's just something in the environment. Once you give something a name, it becomes intimate. It feels different to relate to something that has a name.
Yeah.
But the problem is that by giving something a name, we sort of make it familiar, right? And we suffer the illusion that we've managed to grasp the entire thing and it's all visible to us.
Yeah, we can define it. We can define it by its limitations, and now we have it. It's ours.
We have a whole grasp. Yeah. Exactly. It's important now and again to realize that we don't actually know this. We don't actually know what things are. Things elude our grasp. Even if we have a name to refer to them by, things elude our grasp, and there's so much about them that we don't know. And I think it's important also to remember that in God, we do not know what God is.
Mhm.
This is so important. So I recently finished translating a book by the philosopher Richard Carney, a book called Theism, Returning to God After God. I translated it into Romanian for a publisher in Romania. And he makes this point that it's important to have this experience of like expropriation and sort of bewilderment where you no longer understand what this thing is, because then you're actually truly seeing it. Previously, we talk about things, but we're actually talking about our concepts most of the time and not so much about the things themselves, right? We have to have this moment, this experience where we're sort of bewildered and like the concept is erased and we're just confronted with this thing that we don't know how to make sense of. Then actually we're seeing the thing. When we see it as unfamiliar, then we're seeing what it is in a really profound way. And it's extremely important to have that with God, because if we assume that we know what God is and what he wants, then we'll become extremists.
Yeah.
Our enemies will become God's enemies.
Yeah.
Our points of view become God's point of view because he just becomes like one of us, right? We have to allow God to be free of our understanding so that we don't form an idol out of him and so that we don't appropriate him for our purposes. He might not in fact be on our side.
I feel like there has to be a phenomenological name for that, like shock of realizing. Is there a name? Do you have one for it?
So Carney uses different terms, but I can't remember them now. I
Okay.
would have to check the book. I don't remember.
Every now and then I do that with God, and I think about like, I have this concept, and usually it's that God is huge, that he's just like
Yeah.
this really big being, right? Yeah, and I go like, well, why would I think that? And I go through this process and go, what if he's exactly the same size as me? And then I think like there is no, like, he doesn't exist in the way I exist, but he can incarnate like he did in the furnace, or like he did if it was a theophany for him to walk in the garden, like
Yeah.
he was our size. And that terrifies me way more than like a giant God, because I'm like, okay, this giant being, this big hand, that makes sense. I've thought about that a lot. But if he's just like here and he's like Parker and says my name, like that terrifies me. It's
Yeah.
horrifying. And I
Yeah.
love God, but that brings like this fear and awe of like the other. Like here's this uncreated being, and I think of it as an old man, and it's like, stop doing that, because he is younger than you, right? Because there's no age kind of thing going on here. He stays here and I get older. And I'm this old man, but I'm talking to him and he's still eternally like youthful, whatever, if we can even say that, right? But it freaks me out, man. And it's really helpful for me to get that kind of shock and think about like the awe and wonder of, I'm still using categories of age and time, which are not appropriate, to God, but to help me think and like smash my other categories.
Right.
And
I think
it's so cool.
what you're talking about is exactly right. And Jean-Luc Marion has a chapter at the end of his book In Excess where he talks about negative theology. And he quotes from church father after church father and figure after figure, where they say that knowledge of God is precisely ignorance of God. Once you like manage to free yourself from the grip of a conceptual idol and some understanding of God, once you realize that actually the way you understand God is not adequate to him, and you're left in this state of I don't know what God is, that's when you know God. So it's that uncomfortable like bewilderment, that uncomfortable confusion and lack of knowledge that is actually the true knowledge of God for these people. Once you simply don't know what God is, and you actually have like come face to face with him, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's so good, and I really like that. So when we're smashing our concepts of God, though, can we still affirm that like he's good and that he loves me, and like, because those are still part of the concept, right?
Well, what's interesting is that destroying these concepts, this is like a sort of a phenomenological work. In phenomenology, there's a method. It's called the bracketing. In order to do phenomenology, you have to bracket your prior assumptions about the thing in question and simply attend to it in experience. And what you find is that your prior assumptions were not totally wrong, but they're refined. You learn to rethink them by consulting the experience of the object and setting aside your assumptions. So I think, for example, when we smash these conceptual idols of ours and we learn to rethink God, we'll come to more or less the same way of talking about God, but we'll sort of understand this way of talking with a greater refinement. So, for example, when we talk about the goodness of God, I think that in light of the doctrine of divine simplicity, God's goodness means that he causes things that are good for us. When I say, for example, that God loves me, I don't mean that God, has these feelings of giddiness and he just like really enjoys being around me or whatever. I think that what it means is that he causes things that are for my good. So the love of God is a way that created realities are related to him and to me, right? They are for my good. That's why, and he's their cause. That's why he loves me. So I would think that like this task of conceptual, idol smashing or iconoclasm, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah, that's good.
Conceptual iconoclasm, it's useful because it helps us to think more accurately about God. But it's always a work in progress, right? Maybe like in the future, I will come to refine my understandings because I never come at a final answer. As long as I'm in life, I could always improve the way I think about things. I could always come to a different conclusion. I can always adopt a new angle at things from which new things are visible for me. And, so it's never a complete work. That
Yeah.
I'm always, in via, so to speak.
Yeah, that's good. When I first wanted to start reading Husserl, I saw that he talked about presuppositions a lot, and I was very deep into Van Til, and I thought, let's go. Then I saw him saying, like, we need a presupposition less, like, we need to bracket those. And I said, well, I'm done with this. And so now I'm kind of coming full circle, and I'm going back and thinking, like, I think the way you explained it is really helpful, and that's what I already do anyways, where I'm bracketing out my conceptions, my assumptions, my presuppositions about God, and then saying, like, who is he, who, and not just running with these conceptions. And I think a lot of us do that, right? We have this idea of God, and then we go to war because your conceptions are different than mine, and mine are right and yours are wrong, and I'm going to destroy you if you try to smash my conceptions.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
this is the difficulty, and this is what I write about in my dissertation. In the final chapter of my dissertation, I talk about the possibility of theology without anathemas.
Mm.
This is a really striking issue. My
Yeah.
more conservative friends will not like this, and then my more liberal friends will be like, "Yeah," even though I don't agree with them on anything, and I still think they're deadly wrong, even though I don't want to do a theology with anathemas. Why do theology without anathemas? Because, like I was saying earlier, we cannot come to final answers. We cannot come to an infallible theological knowledge, and this is what I argue for in my dissertation. And so that's why we don't have theology that's why we have theology without anathemas, because I cannot ever say this is it. This is the final, statement of this doctrine. Now, even though I admit this as a theoretical possibility, I am actually not inclined at all to move beyond the ecumenical statements about the Incarnation and the Trinity, for example.
Yeah.
But as a matter of theoretical necessity, I say no, even those statements are not in principle final, even though personally, in terms of my own temperament, I would not like to go beyond them. So I think that theology without anathemas is important, and theology without anathemas is what prevents me from going to war with you because you have a different conception of God. Right? I admit that I can be wrong about God, just as you admit that you can be wrong about God, and so we work together instead of fighting each other.
So yeah, the fundamentalists just got mad again. So so how does this impact like our view of the perspicuity of Scripture? Like God gave us a sure word, and in but we still have to, like, you got phenomenology still, so I'm still interpreting this word, right? And I think that my interpretation is not infallible, even if I say that his word is. Actually, you're a Fuller man. I don't know if you can say that, if it's infallible, or maybe it's infallible but not inerrant or whatever.
You're asking exactly the right questions, because in precisely the chapter where I talk about theology without anathemas, first I argue against theological infallibility. And I say that theological infallibility has two versions. One of them is the claritas scripturae, the perspicuity of Scripture, and the other one is an infallible magisterium. And I argue that we cannot get theological infallibility by either way. The clarity of Scripture goes out, infallible magisterium goes out. I don't believe in those.
The magisterium would be more like the Eastern and Catholic.
Correct. Yeah.
Even though it does play out in non-denominational
Sort of,
as well.
De facto, they have something like
less formal,
but it's just less formal, and they don't dress as nicely. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
So yeah, I argue that no, the clarity of Scripture, that's not a possibility for various phenomenological reasons. Similar reasons apply also in the case of the infallible magisterium. So there is no infallibility in theology. And because there is no infallibility in theology, we simply have this collaborative theological task of trying to understand who is this Jesus Christ who has claimed us as his own. So I say that, and this is another interesting point, and I talk about this in the final chapter of my dissertation. I think a lot of theological war really has to do with like soteriological anxiety.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Are worried about their salvation, and they have to have it all right theologically, And so therefore they go to war over things, because if they're wrong about this, they're going to hell. I think that, but again, that doesn't mean that we do actually have theological infallibility just because we suppose we need it.
Sure.
Right? So I say that the way out of it is to reject theological infallibility, and also to opt for, once more returning to Torrance and to Barth, to opt for a more realized, actualized objective doctrine of the atonement. So I say that Christian theology starts from two assumptions, two principles. I call these ecclesiological sola fide and ecclesiological solus Christus. Ecclesiological sola fide says that a Christian is just a person who is convinced about himself that, like the Heidelberg Catechism says, I belong to Jesus Christ, body and soul, in life and in death. Mm-hmm. That's what a Christian is. Somebody who has that self-conviction, that's what makes a Christian. Whatever else they might say, whatever else they might believe, that's what makes a person a Christian.
Well, there are going to be people who say that, right? I affirm this, Lord, Lord, and he's like, well, I don't know you though. Right. So
that's another question. But I'm saying that everybody is a Christian, phenomenologically speaking. What makes a person a Christian is this conception.
Okay.
They belong to Christ. Although I will say, like, simply calling Christ Lord is not the same thing as believing that you belong to him. So right. there's a difference there.
Okay.
And then ecclesiological solus Christus is the idea that the church is all those persons whom Christ actually claims as his own. Mm. So the being of the church consists entirely in the fact that Christ considers these people to belong to him, whoever these people are. And I say that you can have theology without anathemas if you have a highly actualized doctrine of the atonement, so that Christ dies and atones for the sins of all of humanity, so that everybody belongs to him, whether they know it or not. And that is the basis for doing theology. Theology begins once I realize that Christ has died for me, that I belong to him, and now I want to know him more. Right? So there's no soteriological anxiety, because I already know that I start from the belief that I belong to Christ. I don't have to work my way up to him somehow through the correct theology. My theology is not a condition of my belonging to him, because I belong to him before I do any theology.
But so then you've got that by way of like universal atonement, right?
Correct. Yeah.
But so is that universal salvation?
No, because like in the Old Testament, for example, they were all taken out of Egypt, but they didn't all make it to the Promised Land. They died.
So we have universal atonement, but not universal preservation.
I wouldn't use these are like Reformed Calvinist categories, and I don't think they're exactly correct. I don't know that I would use exactly these words, but I would say, for example, that Christ dies for everybody. Everybody belongs to him, but not everybody accepts this. Some people react against this. Some people hate Christ, and to them, it's all the same whether they belong to him or not. They hate him, right? Okay. Such a person like that cannot be saved. Obviously, that person is lost.
Yeah.
As long as he remains that way. But the starting point for everybody, the fundamental truth about everyone, is that they belong to Christ, as far as I'm concerned, because Christ has died for everybody. So that's where theology starts. That's why there's no soteriological anxiety. That's why you can have theology without anathemas, because it's not a matter of our life or death that we get these answers wrong. We already belong to Christ. We're simply trying to figure out more about him.
Well, I like that, but if not everyone is actually saved, if everyone's atoned for, but will not make it to the Promised Land, then isn't there still that anxiety to say, like, because then the actualization of their atonement, like they have to accept it, they have to accept that he has it, that they do belong to Christ. Then don't we still get this anxiety back because you don't believe in the right way, like you don't accept Christ. Oh, but you're saying it's just having the phenomenal experience of saying I belong to Christ.
Yeah, there is no right way to, Here, once more, I will appeal to Torrance and Barth, and I will say that even our response to God is preceded by Christ's response on our behalf. Okay. Here I'm going to appeal to a doctrine of the vicarious humanity of Christ. Nobody responds to God perfectly. Nobody responds to the grace of the gospel perfectly. Christ responds to God's grace perfectly on our behalf.
Sure.
Well, Christ does everything for us. We just enjoy the benefits of what he's done.
What about that initial step towards not hating Christ, I guess?
Well, what's interesting, here I will return to Michel Henry. The way we think about things is one thing, and what we're actually doing is another, right? Okay. So it could be that like some people do not hate Christ; they just don't know that what they're doing is precisely a love of Christ. For example, Christ says that anybody who does the will of God will see that what my words are true. So he's assuming that like there can be these people out there who are doing God's will, and they will simply recognize Christ for what he is. Just like the shepherd, the shepherd and the sheep know the shepherd's voice, and they will recognize his voice when they hear it. You might interpret this in a reformed way to say that, there are some elect people who are predestined by God for salvation. And then when they hear the gospel, God is predestined that they will believe through the activity of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. But there's another way of understanding that. There are simply some people who are already out there in the world who are already, love Christ, even though they don't know that, right? They're simply disposed in the proper way in their spirit. And when they do come across Christ, they will love him. Mm-hmm. So, you can have some people who in this life perhaps never hear Christ. But to me, this is speculative, but to me, it's at least an open possibility that when they die at the resurrection, they will find out about Christ and they'll think, yeah, I love this guy. And you can point to, for example, the parable of the sheep and the goats. The answer that they give, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and we gave you something to eat? When did we ever see you thirsty and we gave you something to drink? That answer presupposes that they'd never heard that parable, right? Yeah. Because if they'd heard the parable, they'd be able to follow it.
Sure.
Right? So, maybe there are just some people out there who love Christ and they don't realize that this is what they love. But when the time is right, they will see Christ and they will recognize his voice and they will go to him.
Yeah, that's interesting. The Reformed fundamentalist is like, in my head, is like, well, then you're saying that there's some people who are inherently better than others because they would respond in love to Christ just out of their own nature, because we're all on the same level if Christ has atoned for all of us. But then some of us are just more able to respond to the call, while others, even though they've been bought by Christ, they still deny him just inherently. But I don't mean to press you on all the finer points of your dissertation or anything like that.
So I would say that everybody responds to Christ because of the grace of God. In the first place, we don't exist unless God causes us to exist. So there's one. In the second place, the fact that a person is well disposed in spirit to respond to Christ is itself a matter of that person's interaction with God over the course of his entire life.
Amen.
So God is active in more places than just where somebody happens to be preaching the gospel.
So good, man. That's great. That fits like with my understanding of the world as a novel. That God is. It's not mine. It's Dr. Van Hooser's, and he's interjecting and he's engaging with us through his divine interjection. Which maybe you don't like that, but this whole process of our lives is a dialogue with God. We're answering or not answering, and we're hardening our hearts. I wanted to finish with
present to us. That's the idea. We're never like away from God. Even if nobody's talking to us about Christ, we are never away from God.
Right. Yeah. We live in his story. Yeah.
And as a result also of the consubstantiality of Father and Son, that means that we're never away from Christ.
Right. So I wanted to finish. Can I ask one more question here?
Yeah. I should get going soon, but I've really enjoyed the conversation.
This has been awesome. Yeah. Okay. So final thing, hopefully, it doesn't take too long. So how is it that God can go from a state of like not creating to this, and we've talked about this a little bit, but to a state of creating, from being like not creator to being creator? Maybe just deny that. Help me out. Yeah.
I would say that he doesn't, because God doesn't create in time. He creates all of time at once. So, given that there's a world, God has always been the creator of this world.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can talk about it modally, like across possible worlds. How is it that in this possible world, God creates the world and in this one, he doesn't? Mm-hmm. Well, because God's relation to the world is indeterministic, right? And it could have happened and it could not have happened. But there's not much more to say than that. And I would also point, like Thomas says, for example, that creation is a real relation in the creature, but not in God.
Okay.
God is not affected or changed or transformed in any way by the fact that he creates me. But I am, right? I come into being thanks to God, but God is not changed in any way by the fact that he creates me. I depend on God, but he does not depend on me in any way whatsoever. So that's how I would say there is no actually change in God involved from creating, not creating to creating. What happens is the creation comes into being.
In the possible world where he chooses not to create, he's not a creator in that world.
Correct.
But then in this world, he is a creator. So it seems like there's a change there between God in that possible world versus this possible world. There's something that we can predicate of God that we can't in this world that we can't predicate of him in the other world.
That's true.
We wouldn't even exist, but yeah.
That's true, but the not all predication is intrinsic. So sometimes I say, for example, like when I say that a building is huge, right? We talk like that all the time, but what do we mean? We just mean that it's big relative to us.
Not relative to the sun or something.
Right, and there's no such thing as hugeness in nature. Hugeness is relative to us, right? If we were the size of cats, then a lot of things would be huge to us. If we were the size of elephants, then fewer things would be huge to us.
Sure, sure.
So when we say that something is huge, we're predicating it in relation to ourselves. We're giving it a predication of the way that it relates to us.
Okay.
And so also, when we say that God is creator, we mean that we depend on him for our existence. But there's nothing about him.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing in God that we're referring to. We're referring to ourselves and the fact that we depend on him. Just like when I call a building huge, I say that it's a lot bigger than me, but I'm not saying anything about the building in itself.
Yeah. Well, that's helpful. That perspectival, and maybe that's a phenomenological move too. But I really like that, dude. This has been so helpful. I really appreciate. Thanks for all your time. We were supposed to just talk about simplicity, but we went all over the map. I really appreciate you indulging me there.
No, it's my pleasure. I love talking about this stuff, and I don't get to do it very often. So
Yeah.
I enjoyed myself also.
Awesome. Well, dude, please come back and let's talk about the phenomenology and your research a little bit more too.
I'm always down. Absolutely.
All right. Well, this is gonna have to do it, folks. This has been Parker's Pensies, and as always, all glory to God.